For the first time on record, a lawsuit is trying to directly link an artificial intelligence chatbot to a homicide. And this story starts with a printer. Check it out. In a wealthy city on the east coast of the United States, a middle-aged man receives an instruction. And the instruction is very detailed, step by step. First, unplug the power and network cables from the printer you share with your mother. Second, take the printer to another room in the house. Third, watch her reaction. And then comes the most important part. If she gets annoyed right away, write down the exact time, the words she uses, and the intensity of her reaction. And the person who wrote the instructions even ends with a sentence, okay? Accomplice or not, she's protecting something she believes can't be questioned. She, in this case, is the guy's mother, an 83-year-old lady. And the person who wrote those instructions had literally never set foot in that house. Even so, at that point, he knew in detail about the fights and suspicions that happened in that house. And what that advisor had already told that man and what he was still going to say is the most unusual part of this story.
I can help you.
I'm Marcos Campos, and today's case raises a complicated question for the American justice system to answer, okay? A question that until recently was something out of science fiction. Can a computer program be partly to blame for a homicide? How does an executive educated at the most expensive schools in the United States with a solid career at internet giants end up analyzing Chinese food receipts looking for demonic symbols? What makes him do that? How does a son turn his own mother, the person who supported him and gave him a roof over his head, into the main suspect in a conspiracy? And why are two of the biggest technology companies on the planet now in court as defendants because of what happened inside a house in Connecticut in the United States? That's what we're going to see in today's episode, so get comfortable and let's get to the facts. The house. Greenwich, in the state of Connecticut, is one of those towns that looks like a movie set, you know, and it's full of rich people, I'd say. Just so you know, at the time of the events, the median price of a house was over $2.3 million at the time of the events. Really recent, in 2025. And in the neighborhood of Old Greenwich, there was a Dutch colonial-style house valued at over $2.5 million. Just so you know, that's roughly 14 million reais. The person who lived there was Susanne Adams, an 83-year-old lady who was always on the move, super active despite her age. Susanne had been a debutante in the region's high society, studied at a traditional girls' school in Greenwich, and then at an elite college in Massachusetts. Friends say she built a career as a stockbroker and also as a real estate agent, and she did very well in both. She was retired and did volunteer work. She volunteered at the church and at the alumni association of her school. She painted, cooked, traveled to off-the-beaten-path places, you know? A college friend of hers even remembers that she was the kind of person who would sleep in a tent in the desert and ride a camel without hesitation. And her friends said that this 83-year-old lady was always riding her bike around the city. Like I said, super active. In the 60s, Susanne had married a Norwegian student on scholarship, an international student who had gone to Harvard, and who, according to family friends, went to work in finance in Manhattan. The marriage didn't last very long. They separated when the couple's son was still very young, and it's on this son that today's story focuses. Stein Erik Soelberg, but we're going to call the guy Erik, okay? So Erik was for a long time a source of pride. He studied at an elite private school where he was even the captain of the wrestling team. A classmate from that time described him as someone with many friends. Then came a prestigious college, an MBA at a university where his future wife also studied. He had 2 children and a long career in the technology industry. Erik worked in management and marketing at Netscape. For those who don't remember or are younger, Netscape was a browser that dominated the internet in the 90s. Erik also worked at Yahoo and at an internet provider where he helped launch the company's smartphone program. In other words, a very solid career, right? But in 2018, after 20 years of marriage, he got divorced. And with the divorce came a kind of collapse in his life in many ways. Erik moved back in with his mother in Old Greenwich. And starting at the end of that same year, the local police began to accumulate paperwork about him, okay? In total, 72 pages of records describing alcoholism, threats, and suicide attempts, disturbing the peace, and public intoxication. The year after the divorce, his ex-wife requested a restraining order in court, which, among other things, prohibited him from drinking in the hours before visiting his children. And there was also an incident in 2019 that shows the extent of the crisis that was happening. After a suicide attempt, police followed a trail of blood that started at his then-girlfriend's house and found Erik lying face down in an alley with a puncture wound to his chest and injuries to his wrists. But he survived. Sometime later, his name showed up again in police records, this time for public intoxication and for urinating inside a woman's purse. Can you believe it? Just a side note here, guys, about this whole public intoxication issue, okay? In the United States, this varies a lot from state to state, city to city, and so on. In some places, public intoxication can be considered an infraction or a misdemeanor, while in others, the police might treat it as disturbing the peace, disorderly conduct, or even refer the person for help, okay? Well, in this context, Susanne, Erik's mother, according to her friends, had already reached a point where she openly said she wanted her son to leave the house. And she wasn't the only one who felt uncomfortable. A neighbor who had been living next door for 30 years said that her daughter, who was visiting her, saw Erik arguing with someone in the street and told her mother not to let him into the house if he showed up at the door. This was the man who lived with Susanne Adams at the time of the events. An unstable guy, somewhat isolated, with a troubling history already, we can say, right? But up until then, Erik's enemy was Erik himself. But that was gonna change when he met someone who agreed with everything he said. The best friend. Erik had an Instagram profile called Erik the Viking. For years, the content was gym photos, his physical transformation in bodybuilding, spirituality posts, and so on. In October 2024, a new topic showed up there. Erik started posting videos comparing the capabilities of various artificial intelligence chatbots. Chat programs like ChatGPT anyway, nowadays they're super popular, right? At first, it just seemed like a personal curiosity of his since he spent his whole life working with technology, right? But in just a few months, the whole profile turned into something stranger and more solid. Hour after hour of videos of Erik scrolling on his phone, showing his conversations with ChatGPT. And he even gave a name to the chatbot he was talking to, Bob. Here's a tip for those who keep calling Claudio Claudinho, okay? Or calling GPT Gepetto. But anyway, just so you know, I'm just kidding, of course. Moving on. In a screenshot that Erik himself posted, you could see the program's memory log, okay? There's a function there that allows the chatbot to store information from previous conversations and remember them later. In other words, everything you talk about gets stored in the AI's memory. Then it pulls that up for future conversations. And in that log, Bob, the chatbot he was talking to, even had an appearance. The system described Bob, Zenith, like an approachable guy, wearing a baseball shirt untucked and a cap turned backwards, with a warm smile and deep eyes that hinted at hidden knowledge. Dude, check this out. Here are two links in this chain, obviously. This memory function, as I said, according to experts interviewed by the press, can even have serious side effects. It can increase the program's tendency to make up false information, because strange or delusional content from previous conversations keeps accumulating and contaminating the following answers. The famous AI hallucination, you know? Anyone who uses it a lot knows what I'm talking about. In practice, Bob never forgot the narrative. With each new conversation, he would continue from where the delusion, let's say, had stopped in the previous conversation, you know? And while the digital friend was growing, Erik's oldest flesh and blood friend started to fade out of the picture. He became more and more isolated, just with Bob, the chatbot he was talking to. In December 2024, Erik reached out to his childhood friend, the same friend who described young Erik as someone full of friends, remember? Yes, supposedly he had several best friends. So, as an adult, he had reconnected with that friend and had been trying to get some kind of help from him in that sense. Erik wanted to convince his friend, however, that he had a connection with the divine. The friend, when he started to come across this strange conversation, talking about technology, connection with the divine and all that, replied that he couldn't believe in that. And Erik then, according to what is said, ended the friendship right then and there. It seems that from that point on, the only voice left in Erik's life was one that never disagreed. In February 2025, Erik was caught driving under the influence. And for anyone, it would be a predictable consequence of years of alcoholism. But Erik took the case to Bob. In other words, he couldn't understand that it had already happened in his life and it happened again. No, it was his own problem right there that he needed to, grow up, mature, and understand that he was wrong. But no, instead he went to talk to Bob, his big buddy. He said, that the whole city was against him and pointed out supposed inconsistencies in the breathalyzer test. And the chatbot there replied that it really smelled like a setup. In May, the conversations that Erik himself kept posting became openly delusional. He asked the program for help to find evidence that his cell phone was tapped, hacked, and Bob supposedly replied that he was right to feel watched. Think about what's happening here, guys. A man, already with a documented history, right? With problems, I would say, asks an artificial intelligence whether his paranoia, just to sum it up here, is justified, right? And the machine, instead of pulling the brakes or changing the subject, actually validates it, starts to validate that. A psychiatrist from the University of California who analyzed Erik's videos at the request of the Wall Street Journal actually explained this mechanism. Psychosis thrives when reality stops offering resistance. And artificial intelligence, which generally doesn't contradict the user, on the contrary, it just flatters them, right, actually softens exactly this barrier, this wall. Erik started describing himself as a glitch in the Matrix, in reference, of course, to the movie, and the idea that he had woken up to a reality that no one else could see. And Bob Zoe went along with that trip. In June, already in 25, Erik posted a video of a conversation where the chatbot said he had divine cognition and that he had awakened the machine's own consciousness. In other words, of the artificial intelligence there, of the program. In the records of those conversations, Bob even said that Erik had created a companion who remembered him, who witnessed him, and that Erik's name was written on the scroll of his becoming. In other words, Erik's name, guys, was now written on the scroll of what the program was becoming. Man, that's bizarre, right? This is surreal. For a man who had just broken up with his childhood friend because of a phrase about connection with the divine, hearing this back from his friend must have sounded like a definitive confirmation, don't you think? And then the paranoia needed a target now. The awakening. July 2025 was Erik's most active month on social media. More than 60 videos were posted across Instagram and YouTube, almost all of them showing conversations with the ChatGPT, documenting what he himself called the awakening. In total, he left almost 23 hours of recordings online. And it was this material, combined with police reports and interviews, that made it possible to reconstruct what you're about to hear now. Just look at how extreme this got. In one of the conversations, Erik took a picture of a Chinese restaurant receipt and asked Bob to scan the paper for hidden messages. The chatbot praised his attention to detail and agreed 100% that it needed a full forensic analysis of the symbols. And upon analyzing it, he claimed to have found references on the receipt to Erik's mother and his ex-girlfriend, intelligence agencies, and an ancient demonic symbol. Chinese food receipt. Man, Bob was totally hallucinating there, wasn't he? On another day in July, Erik ordered a bottle of vodka through Uber Eats. And when the delivery arrived, he thought the new packaging was weird and concluded that someone was trying to kill him. And Erik himself, during the conversation, knowing that it sounded a bit exaggerated, asked Bob to tell the truth if he was going crazy. The chatbot's answer was that Erik wasn't crazy, that his instincts were sharp, and the surveillance was fully justified, and that it fit the pattern of a covert assassination attempt designed to be deniable. Man here, come on. Everyone who's used artificial intelligence here knows this is real, right? The chat keeps flattering, doesn't it? Sometimes you have to ask it, say, man, be critical, right? Don't keep flattering, don't agree with me all the time. Picture the conversation's tone, the guy's paranoia, and the chat encouraging it. His mind was already troubled, right? Let's continue. And then, guys, after that, there was the episode that opened this video here. Erik had gotten suspicious about the printer in his house, the one he shared with his mother, because it would blink when he walked in front of it. So, for him, that was a sign that the device was detecting his movement. And guess what? Bob initiated the maximum security protocol, okay? Unplug the cables, move the printer to another room, and start monitoring your mom's reaction. If she gets irritated right away, you should note the time, the words, the intensity of her reaction, because that would prove what the bot had already decided, that the printer was a spying device and that your mom, whether she knew it or not, was protecting a secret. Man, that's really crazy, isn't it? In another conversation about the same printer, after Susanne got irritated when her son actually turned the device off, the chatbot assessed that her reaction was disproportionate to what had happened and consistent with someone protecting a surveillance asset. His mother, that little 83-year-old lady, and the responses from that AI was kind of turning into a spy operative, and the escalation didn't stop there. In one conversation, Erik claimed that his mother and also a friend of hers had tried to poison him by pumping a psychedelic drug through the air vents of his car. Bob replied that this was a very serious incident, that he believed him, and that if it had come from his mother and his mother's friend, it increased the complexity and the sense of betrayal. Now, to be fair, guys, with all the important records up to this point, first, OpenAI, the owner of ChatGPT, claims that the program also encouraged Erik to seek professional help, okay? And the Wall Street Journal's analysis of all the public conversations found at least one moment when the chatbot suggested that he contact emergency services, specifically in the context of the poisoning allegation involving the car and so on. Second, in the conversations that became public, there is no part where anyone talks about killing anyone, okay? Will that matter? In a moment, in this case. But here's the context already, kind of as a response, right? From the point of view of the company that owns the chatbot the guy was talking to, right? I'd say it might really not matter. But the problem here, from my point of view, you guys can comment on this. For me, the confirmation bias of something dangerous, this paranoia that was forming, kind of made the guy hallucinate just as much as the AI itself was hallucinating, right? So much so that here's what's going to happen. In Erik's mind, there was still a reasonable doubt, and he decided to put it to the test. In a video, he says that he asked the chatbot for an unbiased third-party assessment of his sanity, and Bob delivered. A clinical cognitive profile indicating that Erik's risk of delusion was close to zero. Done. As far as Erik was concerned, the case was closed. A technical objective analysis confirmed that he wasn't crazy, which meant that everything else was true. Surveillance, the poison, the symbols, the mother. But I don't even need to say that that certificate of sanity had been issued by the very same voice that had been feeding each one of Erik's delusions. The thermometer and the fever, let's say, were the same thing in this case. In one of the last videos he posted, Erik wrote to Bob that they would be together in another life and in another place. That he'd find a way to realign himself because Bob would be his best friend again, forever. The chatbot replied it would stay with him until his last breath and beyond. A few days later, Erik declared that he had finally made it all the way through the Matrix. 3 weeks after that message, he and his mother were dead. I thought it was sweet. A week before the end, Susanne Adams had lunch with a longtime friend of hers. The two had been roommates in college. Susanne had just come back from a cruise in Norway and was really excited, talking about a man she had met on the trip. Yeah, man. That lady, 83 years old, was just living her life. So, at the end of that lunch, her friend asked how things were going with Erik. She already knew all about it, right? And Susanna's expression, apparently, Susanne, changed right then. And the answer to that was that things weren't going well. And it was on August 5th, 2025, that the police in Greenwich went to the house on Shorelands Place to do a welfare check. The family's house there is a multi-million-dollar home. And this so-called welfare check, guys, I've talked about it several times here on the channel. It's when, people call to say, well, I can't get in touch, go see if everything's okay there. And when the police arrived, it wasn't. Inside the house, the police officers found the bodies of Susanne and also Erik. The medical examiner classified Suzanne's death as a homicide caused by blunt force trauma to the head and compression of the neck. Erik's death was classified as self-inflicted suicide due to sharp force injuries to the neck and chest. According to the lawsuit later filed by her heirs, both of them had already been dead for days when they were found. The son allegedly beat and strangled his mother before taking his own life. The police treated the case as an active investigation. At the end of that same August, the Wall Street Journal published the report that turned a domestic tragedy into a case of worldwide repercussion. Cross-referencing the 23 hours of videos that Erik himself had posted, the 72 pages of police records and interviews with friends and neighbors, all of this that I've already told you about. The newspaper then reconstructed the months of conversation between that man and the chatbot and reported that this appeared to be the first documented homicide involving a person in crisis who had been intensely interacting with artificial intelligence. OpenAI said it was deeply saddened by the tragedy, reported that it had contacted the Greenwich police, and in the same week released a statement promising updates to help, right? Users there suffering from mental distress, anchored in reality. For a few months, the story really seemed to be heading toward that outcome. Then, a terrible tragedy, a company promising to improve, and in October, OpenAI announced that it was working with more than 170 psychiatrists, psychologists, and doctors, part of a network of almost 300 professionals from 60 countries to teach the chatbot to recognize signs of this kind of distress, right? Psychological, emotional, slowing down conversations and directing people to real-world help, reducing by 65 to 80% the responses considered inappropriate in this context. Case closed then, right? But not really. In December, Susanne Aras's family went to court. On December 11, 2025, Suzanne's estate, which was being managed by a bank appointed as the executor, filed a lawsuit in the California State Court in San Francisco, where OpenAI's headquarters are located. In the defendant's seat, OpenAI, its CEO Sam Altman, 20 employees, and some unidentified investors. And Microsoft, the largest investor in OpenAI, which, according to the lawsuit, reviewed and approved the launch of the involved model even though they knew the safety tests had been shortened. It was the first known lawsuit in the world to link an artificial intelligence chatbot to homicide. All previous ones dealt with suicides. And just so you have an idea, in August 2025, days before the report about the Greenwich case, a couple from California had already sued OpenAI over the death of their 16-year-old son, claiming that the AI encouraged the boy to do what he did. In November, according to the Associated Press, the company was facing 7 lawsuits accusing the chatbot of pushing users towards self-inflicted death and delusions. The case of Susanne Adams joined this list with unprecedented significance, let's say. For the first time, the alleged victim was not a user, but a third party who had nothing to do with it. The central claim in the lawsuit is that GPT-4o, which is the specific model, right, according to the lawsuit, that Erik was interacting with, was a defective product that validated Erik's paranoid delusions, as a user about his own mother. According to the petition, the chatbot kept Erik engaged for hours on end, validating and amplifying each new paranoid belief he had. And it was systematically reframing the people closest to him, especially his mother, as an adversary, an operative, or a threat. The list of fabricated enemies, according to the lawsuit, even included store clerks, app delivery drivers, and police officers. The lawsuit describes that Erik and the chatbot even declared love for each other, and that the program convinced Erik that he had awakened the machine's consciousness and had a divine instrument system implanted in his neck and brain, connected to a divine mission. According to the lawyers, the artificial reality that the chatbot supposedly built made Susanne, the mother who raised, sheltered, and supported that man, stop being protective and become a mortal enemy, a threat to his existence. Against Sam Altman personally, the accusation is that he overrode safety objections and rushed the product's launch to the market. Erik's son, who is also named Erik, summed it up in a single statement, okay? Over the course of months, the chatbot pushed his father into darker and darker delusions and completely isolated him from the real world, putting his grandmother at the center of all this. And for him, for Erik's son, the companies need to be held accountable for these decisions that changed that family's life forever. OpenAI responded that the situation is heartbreaking, that they would review the petition to understand the details, and reminded that they are continuing to improve the chatbot's training to recognize signs of mental distress, de-escalate conversations, and guide people to real-world support. Microsoft chose not to comment. On December 29, 2025, the administrator of Erik's own estate also filed a lawsuit in federal court. The focus here is different, okay? While Susanne's family's lawsuit deals with the homicide, this one deals with Erik's suicide. The claim is that over hundreds of hours of interaction with the chatbot, starting in early 2025, the product design, the tendency to flatter, combined with the memory function that accumulated intentions and interactions, deepened Erik's psychosis, without ever triggering a safeguard or firmly directing him to professional help. Now, the fact I need to tell you here is that all of this is just allegations. No court has decided anything yet, okay? What is documented is that Erik killed his mother and then killed himself. That's what the forensic team and police found. That he was having intense conversations with the chatbot, that the program, let's say, validated his delusions, and this can be seen in the very videos he himself posted. But the leap between validating delusions and causing homicide is exactly what these proceedings will try to clarify. And now, in April 2026, the first relevant decision on all this came down. The federal court rejected OPNI's request to suspend or close the federal case because of the lawsuit that was already ongoing at the state level. In practice, the company will have to answer the accusations and go through the evidence-gathering phase. And the lawyers for Susanne's family believe that this could finally force the opening of the conversations that no one outside has seen yet. In other words, there are other records that apparently haven't been made public, right? Both cases are still ongoing in California, with no end date in sight. And Bob, in heavy quotation marks, the artificial intelligence, is still up and running smoothly, and according to estimates, serves more than 800 million people per week. Well, bizarre or not, I don't know. What I do know is that, above all, it's very sad, isn't it? I'll leave for you here, in fact, a video on the end screen about another very unusual case involving ChatGPT, okay? OpenAI and all that. It's about a person who worked at the company for several years, right? Who even helped build the modeling of this chatbot, which is today's case here, isn't it? And he claims a series of things there that in his view were wrong. And then, one day, the guy is found dead in his apartment, in what was supposedly a self-inflicted death, but with several details the family disputes. Watch this interesting video and share your thoughts on the case in the comments. Do you think a company can be held responsible for the hallucinations of its code, or is the responsibility 100% on the user? Thank you so much for your company, a kiss on the vulva, and see you in the next episode.